Could a prisoner swap and the release of Iranian funds lead to more agreements between Iran and the United States? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. United States mainstream media reports a prisoner exchange between the United States and Iran could increase the prospects for further diplomatic cooperation, including containing Iran's nuclear program. That's the view of some officials and analysts. The deal, still to be finalized, calls for the release of 5 U.S. citizens and 5 Iranians, as well as around $6 billion in Iranian funds. Under that agreement, the United States says the money can only be used for humanitarian purposes. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Negar Mortazavi is an Iranian-American journalist and political analyst. John Ghazvinian is executive director of the University of Pennsylvania's Middle East Center. Also with us, journalist, author, and analyst Suraya Leni. And Ali Akbar Dareini is a researcher and writer at the Center for Strategic Studies in Tehran. Welcome to all of you. Ali Akbar Dareini, so we have an agreement now between Iran and the United States, and this agreement is about a prisoner swap as well as the release of Iranian funds in the amount of something like $6 billion. It could be as much as $7 billion, depending on the exchange rate. What can you tell us about this deal, and why now?
This deal is not final yet. If it's going to happen, it will show that Iran and the United States have resorted some sort of diplomacy after months of rising tensions. Tensions escalated between Tehran and Washington after the United States seized an Iranian oil tanker in international waters in violation of international law. And now the Americans portray the situation as if Iran is going to escalate tensions in the Persian Gulf. That's part of the US media and political campaign to deliberately ignore its own seizure of Iranian oil tanker and portray Iran's possible retaliation as a starting point. Now, both sides have agreed to come up with a verbal, informal understanding, and this may help alleviate tensions.
I want to play you a short excerpt of how the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is describing this agreement. Let's listen.
Iran will not be receiving any sanctions relief. And in any instance where we would engage in such efforts to bring Americans home from Iran, Iran's own funds would be used and transferred to restricted accounts such that the monies can only be used for humanitarian purposes, which, as you know, is permitted under our sanctions.
So, Ali Akbar Dareini, Antony Blinken making the point there that this is not sanctions relief. So the money, which is actually Iran's money, can only be used for what the United States terms humanitarian purposes. Iran says it will determine how it uses its assets. Could this be a problem? And you did say that this deal is not finalized. Is this one of the potential obstacles?
It could be. Iran has absolutely no trust in the United States. And what Blinken said is the American narration of the whole issue, not the Iranian one. Iranian money has been seized illegally in South Korea for years, and now it is going to be released. And this release will allow Iran to use its own money. This is Iranian money. This is not the Americans giving any money to Iran. So there is going to be no preconditions, and Iran will decide how to use this money. Blinken and the Biden administration are vulnerable at home. The Republicans are crying out against this likely deal. And just months before the presidential election campaigns in the United States, the Biden administration wants to show that it has given no concessions to Iran. So this is mainly for domestic political consumption. But if this is going to happen, it will open the way for more verbal understandings
Right.
between Iran and the United States. And
Okay.
since Iran has no trust in the United States, the prisoners are going to remain in Iran until the funds are released and the Iranians are released.
Okay. John Ghazvinian, let's listen to the Iranian foreign minister who's been talking about how this agreement was put together.
We have been swapping messages with the American side through Qatar and Oman for months. To us, a prisoner swap is a purely humanitarian issue, and we have set no preconditions for that. We have told the intermediaries that we are ready for the swap within a mutually agreed framework.
So, John, as Ali Akbar Dareini just pointed out a moment ago, this has already become a domestic political issue here in the United States. In fact, Republicans say it is, quote, appeasement, and they describe the payments as, quote, paying a ransom. Notwithstanding what Anthony Blinken said a moment ago, is this sanctions relief?
I mean, that question is really a largely semantic one. I mean, technically speaking, he's correct that it's not actually sanctions relief if the deal, it proceeds along the lines that it has been described. But actually, I think what's interesting is this exact conversation we're having is a really good demonstration of both the advantages and disadvantages of a kind of informal understanding. For a number of months now, the kind of messaging we've been hearing is that a formal return to any kind of JCPOA or version of the JCPOA nuclear deal is probably politically unrealistic, and so it makes more sense for both countries to engage in a sort of unspoken, unwritten understanding or, modus operandi. That has a lot of very clear advantages in a sense, is that it's kind of avoids all of the kind of domestic battles on Capitol Hill on the American side, and it does also have the disadvantage of what we've just seen, which is that you now have, for example, the United States saying, well, this is clearly just going to be, these funds are going to be used to purchase medical supplies from Qatar and sent directly to Iran from there. And then the Iranians are claiming, no, of course not, we're going to use our money exactly the way we want. So this is the thing. When you have an informal understanding, is that both sides can claim whatever they want because there's nothing kind of clearly written out. On the other hand, there's also, I think that can be a sort of advantage because both sides get to claim a sort of political victory, and that doesn't really need to be kind of arbitrated in any sort of formal capacity. And so perhaps it may be the least bad of all the options we actually have before us at the moment.
Negar Mortazavi, great to see you. There's something of a debate going on right now, if only in the US media, about what this means, whether it could be some kind of precursor to other agreements between Iran and the United States, perhaps more significant agreements, perhaps something involving the nuclear deal. I mean, do you see it the same way? Could it open the door to some other agreements?
It could, and on maybe to more understandings. And we've seen some steps in escalation, as your guest in Tehran was also explaining. Iran also escalating its nuclear program in the past months, if not more than a year. And then simultaneously, these back-channel talks with mediation by U.S.-Iran trusted partners to de-escalate. I see this as a precursor, as an opening to de-escalation of tensions. It's a goodwill gesture. It's a humanitarian gesture. It's limited in scope. I see it as a very small understanding. A number of prisoners will be exchanged, and Iran will have access to its own money, which was held in a third country. So this is not going to pass through the U.S. It's not coming out of U.S. taxpayer pockets or anything like that. And then this could be simultaneously leading to more de-escalation from a security, political, nuclear perspective. But at the same time, we have to remember the Biden administration, it took them almost 3 years to arrive at this very limited understanding. And they're too close to election season here in the U.S., I think, for any major deal. When we say deal, we're thinking the Obama-era nuclear deal, the JCPOA. I don't think anything like that is possible in this limited time frame, but it seems like the administration and in Tehran also, they're both interested in de-escalating rather than further escalating.
Soraya, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. There are some questions already being raised about how Iran would be able to use these funds that are going to be released. There was a piece in The Intercept, which is an online newspaper, which reported that Iranian children are dying. Many pharmaceutical companies are afraid to sell medicines to Iran. In many instances, companies are reluctant to conduct transactions for fear that it would violate United States financial sanctions. Is that a serious problem for Iran? And when the United States says, look, you can use this money for humanitarian purposes, but also keeps in place financial sanctions. Is the US being sincere?
No, I don't think they are, and I think what we see is effectively a return to JCPOA, or at least pre-Obama era talks. For example, this has been an issue for about a decade, since probably around 2011, with sanctions on Iran's central bank. So there's been a real issue in terms of getting life-saving medications, or really any kind of humanitarian aid from abroad. And it's true that you can't sanction humanitarian aid; it's illegal. So Blinken's correct in that sense. However, that's not how reality works. Many foreign companies have been incredibly hesitant to trade with Iran because they're afraid, quite frankly, of being sued. And that's happened through, European banks, for example, facilitating transfers, where then the US has effectively sued those banks for millions and millions of dollars for prohibitive sanctions, effectively. So I think that even if there is a deal, it's great news. There are great need for life-saving drugs, particularly for rare blood disorders like thalassemia, for example. However, it really comes down to the fact that there is the US Treasury, a very hawkish American system in place that can sue foreign companies for trading with Iran, even if that trade is, quite frankly, legal, and that leads to an over-policing by businesses, policing themselves effectively to stopping trade with Iran, which they're, quite frankly, able to do.
Ali Akbar Dareini, this agreement, this informal agreement on the prisoner release as well as the release of frozen funds, it's taking place as the New York Times reports that Iran and the US have another informal agreement under which Iran limits its nuclear enrichment program and then restrains militants that it supports both in Iraq and in Syria. What can you tell us about that?
It's too early to say that. First of all, this deal needs to be implemented, and after Iran has verified that it has got back its money and Iranian prisoners are released, if this goodwill is shown, then it may open the way for a further verbal understanding between Iran and the United States. A verbal understanding could be something like Iran freezing the level of its enrichment in return for lifting this part of the sanctions, at least. But it's too early to say about that.
John Ghazvinian, I want to get back to something you were talking about a moment ago, and that is the fact that this is an informal agreement. The Iranian analyst here in Washington, D.C., Trita Parsi, who is also vice president of the Quincy Institute, says an informal agreement is a poor substitute for an official one. But these are the circumstances under which both sides have to work right now. It's a reference to the fact that the United States pulled out, violated, the JCPOA was violated. I mean, does Trita Parsi have a point when he say, look, it should be official?
Yeah, I think Trita's larger point actually was that that it's far from ideal, but it's the best we can probably expect under the current circumstances, which is a point I think most people would actually kind of agree with at this point. I think it is, incontrovertible that at this point, politically, there is simply no room for maneuver in Washington for the idea of a serious formal return to the JCPOA or any version of it. And I think the more or less the same thing can be said politically in Tehran, although Dr. Dareini can enlighten us more on that. It doesn't seem like either country politically is in a place right now, nor will be anytime soon, to be able to return to some kind of big landmark written agreement that's 120 pages, etc., that has to go through Capitol Hill and this, that, and the other thing. Having said that, Iran has been enriching these, in recent months to close to 90%. There have been skirmishes in Iraq and Syria. There have been near misses in the Persian Gulf. There have been seized Iranian tankers. There's been all these kinds of issues bilaterally, which highlights a point that I actually made about a year ago, which is that, the time has come to move on from the JCPOA and recognize that there continues to be a serious larger political dysfunction between these two countries, and that is what needs to be addressed. And to the extent that deals like the one we had this week can even in some very small incremental way begin to do that, then it's better than nothing. And I think the same can be said of sort of informal understandings about enrichment and flashpoints in Iraq and Syria and so on and so on. They're, of course, far from what we would want to see in an ideal world, but the US-Iran relationship has always been far from what we want to see in an ideal world.
Ali Akbar Dareini, what is your view on that? I mean, John makes the point that the very polarized political climate here in the United States is not conducive to a return to the JCPOA. What is it like in Iran?
The Biden administration's Iran policy is a hostage of domestic politics. The Republicans are entirely against any deal. Even part of Democrats are against it. So the Biden administration finds it highly unlikely or very difficult to come to an agreement with Iran. And Iran is not going to accept any deal unless the 2015 JCPOA is going to revive and sanctions to be lifted. Iran has been serious to come to an agreement, but while the Biden could have lifted the sanctions on the first day in office on January 20th, 2021, it didn't do so. He returned to the Paris Climate Agreement, but he did not lift the sanctions.
Yeah.
Instead, the Biden administration continued the same maximum pressure campaign, economic terrorism, sanctions, in order to force Tehran to give in to a new deal that imposes greater restrictions. That has not happened, and don't think it's going to happen. The Raisi administration is not open to that.
Okay, Negar Mortazavi, let's look at this other development. 3,000 United States troops deployed to the Red Sea. They are, according to the US, a response, as Ali Akbar Dareini pointed out earlier on, to Iran seizing oil tankers in the region. Iran says its actions are a response to the US and its allies seizing tankers. The United States media says this risks a face-to-face confrontation between Iranian and US forces. I mean, how great is the risk of this escalating?
Well, I think it is part of those escalation steps that I was talking about on both sides. While I think neither side really wants a direct confrontation or to stumble into a war per se, a military conflict, especially directly. There has been proxy fights going on between Iran and its U.S. allies in the region, but not a direct war. They nearly missed or avoided one during the Trump administration. And I think this time around, the Biden administration is even more reluctant to enter an open conflict. But you could also sleepwalk into a conflict. It's something that could be brewing without you really wanting it or without you really noticing it. I think the administration, the Biden administration, has been maybe a bit too sure, underestimating the risk of the sleepwalking or the conflict, and having too much of an assurance that they have, quote unquote, contained the Iran problem, the Iran situation. On the Iranian side also I think they're risking, yes, the Iranians wanted to return to the nuclear deal, but did they really want it enough? The Biden administration had that golden window of opportunity at the beginning of their time in the White House when they overlapped with the Rouhani administration, the previous one in Iran. But then after that, there have been offer after offer from the U.S. that Tehran has refused as not good enough. So I think both sides are maybe overestimating the situation as far as containing a war or a conflict they don't want, but at the same time letting it brew, and eventually you could stumble into something that can get the other players in the region also involved.
Soraya, looking at how this is unfolding militarily in the region, there are a number of experts, a number of analysts who are warning against an escalation. Ryan Costello of the National Iranian-American Council says he sees it this way. He says it's a dangerous cocktail that's being put together. How do you see it?
Well, absolutely correct. I think tensions between the United States and Iran never serve any good purpose. We saw that under the Trump administration with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and then the shooting down of the Ukrainian plane, and so many civilians got caught in the middle of those tensions and lost their lives. I think diplomacy is really the only solution, finding any kind of channel between the two sides is the solution to de-escalate any tensions, because otherwise, quite frankly, what we're just looking at is this tit for tat situation that we've seen for 3 decades, if not 4 decades. What we need is a complete policy overhaul in Washington when it comes to Iran, because the status quo isn't good enough. And quite frankly, we're talking about a return to the nuclear deal to effectively de-escalate the situation, decrease chance of a military conflict, for example. Well, the bar's pretty low. If that's the best that we can come up with, if that's the best that Washington can come up with, then that's a very, very low bar. I think the chance for an escalation that could lead to a military conflict is definitely still there.
John Ghazvinian, let's talk about the one voice that we haven't talked about yet, and that is how Israel views all these developments between Iran and the United States. And as we are fully aware, Israel is opposed to any kind of engagement with Iran. In fact, since 2010, Israel has been carrying out covert cyber attacks, assassinations against Iranian targets. So how do you think the Israelis would be viewing current developments? Also, being aware that what Israel thinks and what Israel does has an impact on domestic politics in the United States.
Right. So I'm not an expert in Israeli politics, of course, but I do think that Israel is probably a little bit more distracted at the moment than they have been in the past with some of their own domestic challenges. But I think it's also worth just sort of acknowledging that the overall state of affairs between Iran and the United States is not one that is particularly concerning to Israel at the moment. I think their concern has always been at any risk of sort of rapprochement or Iran coming in out of the cold or getting sanctions relief. As long as Iran is kept in a relatively weak position, and it has been for a number of years now, both economically with its sanctions as well as politically, Israel doesn't, I don't think at the moment, see Iran as a sort of imminent dangerous threat. Having said that, Israel has had a rough few months, a rough year, really, broadly speaking. Improvement of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia is not something that I think would have been particularly welcome to Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't see it as one of their top concerns at the moment, given that there's no real risk of a imminent thawing of relations between Iran and the United States.
Akbar Dareini, the Israeli view is that the nuclear deal cannot be modified in any way, that Iran has to completely dismantle its nuclear program. How does Iran look at that kind of demand? Also remembering again that Israel has very powerful allies here in the United States.
The Israeli demand has no place. Iran has already reached a level that cannot be undone. Iran is now a latent nuclear power. That means Iran has the technology, the means, scientists, and nuclear materials to build a nuclear weapon if it makes a political decision to do so. So Iran is a nuclear threshold state, and Israel can do about it. It's up to Iran whether to weaponize its nuclear program or not, and Iran has not decided to do so. But let me just explain this, that the latest level of tensions between Iran and the United States is partly because I read this as a deliberate decision by the Biden administration to undermine the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, and push Saudi Arabia towards normalizing relations with Israel. This is one big reason, probably, that why the United States has built up its military presence on the pretext that it's going to deter Iran in this region.
Right. Negar, do you envisage any kind of scenario where the JCPOA is in fact resurrected, possibly not in the form that it was in 2015, but as a basis for a new agreement?
Not in this term for the Biden administration. Again, I think it really depends on who the next U.S. president is. If Joe Biden or any Democrat, if they get a second term, especially the Biden administration, when you look at the second term, it's more the term for legacy building. I think right now, again, we're too close to election season. It's time for being reelected, and everything becomes a domestic fight, as this has become. But if the Biden administration remains for a second term, President Biden stays, then that's a different story. And we saw in the Obama times Also, it was the second term when the actual JCPOA culminated and happened. So I don't think this term there's enough time for Joe Biden or enough political will. This is something the administration, the president wanted, but I don't think they wanted it enough to be able to spend the political capital that's required for dealing with one of their biggest adversaries. And they haven't done so in the past couple of years. And I don't think they have enough time to do. But more nuclear de-escalation, more understandings, as we've seen in this limited one, I think is possible. And this may be a prelude to more of those step-by-step or goodwill gestures.
Okay, Saray, I've got a little bit of time left, but if we look at the bigger picture here of the United States' involvement in the Middle East, there's an analyst at the Arab Center, Imad Harb, which is based here in Washington. He says what we are now seeing in the Middle East is the U.S. reminding adversaries and allies alike that it is still committed to the region. Harb says this is about American hegemony in the region and also a message to Russia and China. Do you agree?
In part, I think that the United States is a player in the Middle East, and I don't think that's going to change, even though I think its time as a unipolar power of the world has certainly been eclipsed 20 years ago with China and Russia and emergence of other nations, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere else across the board through economics as well as politics. So I do think that the United States is going to continue to be involved in the Middle East, not just because of its history, but also because of weapons deals that it's done with countries like the UAE, for example. When you sell modern weapons and technology to nations, ally nations, effectively you're tethering yourself to those nations and whatever wars they're going to be fighting in the future. Right. So I do think that the road to peace is diplomacy, and that's the only way that tensions can be de-escalated with the United States. And if the US isn't going to get involved, well, China and Russia will.
John, very briefly, despite the so-called pivot to Asia, which we've been hearing a lot of, is this the US really saying, we're here?
I mean, that's always in the background, but I don't know if that's, I think that may be an over-reading of the situation. I think this is, the desire to get prisoners released has been a long-standing objective of the administration. They took the opportunity, but they had it, I think.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.